Okay, so the last things that we're going to take a look at here within chapter three, we left off on, we were discussing dual federalism, what it is, and kind of the, some historical background of it. Now, of course, we're going to switch gears and we're going to go to cooperative federalism, which is more the type of federalism that we see today. We'll take a look at, some aspects of cooperative federalism in terms of how states are able to coordinate with the federal government when it comes to a lot of these programs, especially like education or infrastructure funding. The states and local governments get a lot of money from the federal government to complete a lot of whether it's infrastructure projects or assisting with the education of students. And all kinds of other things, law enforcement as well. We talked before about how a lot of local police departments down here get a lot of federal money. They get a lot of grants that are awarded by the federal government as a means to assist with border security, right? I think we talked about that before, right? I think at the beginning of the chapter we talked about how that uh, there's an incentive for local police departments here to accept that federal money, um, and and what that does for the federal government is to assist with border security, right? To where it's not just border patrol, but also DPS and your county law enforcement, and as well as local law enforcement. They also can help out um, with with border security, right? So that's the incentive as to why the federal government will send out this money, grant this money to to institutions. I mean, it's also not too different from you all getting the FAFSA money, right? The federal government is going to invest in you to provide you with federal financial aid, so that way you can continue you can pursue your studies, because it's in the nation's interest to have their their citizens to be well educated so that they can pursue greater opportunities. So I want you all to think about that, right? I want you all to understand that there's a reason why the federal government is very active when it comes to assisting with the states and local governments when it comes to this money that they grant you, right? They're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart. There is a reason for why they're doing these things. So just kind of keep that in mind as we get into cooperative federalism here. But okay, so anyway, so let's go ahead and excuse me, let's go ahead and get started here. So let me go ahead and share the screen here. And then, so if I sound tired, I'm not really that tired, but for some reason I'm yawning a bit. I guess it's probably because I did so much exercising last night, but it's fine. So let's see. So let me go ahead and let's see, where is it? Okay, hold on. It's not this one here. Okay, okay. Yeah, let me just do this. Okay. Okay, all right. So y'all should be able to see the PowerPoint slide, right? This is where we left off last time, right? We covered when the change that was going on when it came to the Supreme Court's interpretation of federalism, right? And we're going to see how that during this time in American history, in the late 20s, early 30s, we saw a fundamental shift within the Supreme Court's interpretation of of the federal government's power under the Commerce Clause. Sorry, my, sorry, they were messaging me. Um, they always forget that I have class right now, even though I tell them. We saw this change, right? Where, because again, we left on this last time, right? That originally the Supreme Court was kind of taking a hands-off approach, favoring, not too much regulation, that the businesses were basically taking the lead on policy and economic policy. But now we start to see a change to where now the federal government is going to get much more involved with the regulation of the economy and providing social services to people, right? So of course, let me kind of set the stage and then we'll come back here, right? So obviously, of course, the Great Depression is the major. The Great Depression, I don't know. I don't. Well, I guess it does get a lot of attention, but I know when I teach it in my history class, which we're going to be coming up on the Great Depression here in history, in the history class I teach, we're going to be coming up on that in a couple of weeks. Um, I definitely do try to explain to my students that um, that the Great Depression was a fundamental event that changed the role of government. I would say probably forever, right? Changing the role of the federal government, right? I'm sure you all are familiar with the Great Depression, with the stock market crash, and however, a lot of people were out of work, right? But what doesn't get talked about enough is the government response to the Great Depression. And I feel that that is something that, obviously, of course, in the government class, we definitely need to focus on that. Whereas in history, they kind of focus more on the events. Although, since I teach history, I tie in history, into my government class as well. There's a lot of interchangeability there. But with that being said, what we're going to focus on here is we're going to focus on just how much of a response that the federal government took, right? So much so that the federal government had to change the way it did business. So the Great Depression helped bring about increased action from the federal government to respond to the nation's economic crisis, right? So originally, before the federal government expanded its role and its power, state and local governments struggled to handle the needs of the jobless and the poor. So originally, what would happen is that, again, this is the days before the SNAP program. This is the days before Social Security. We didn't have any of those programs. It would be during this time that we would start to see those programs that we still see today. Originally, it was the states and the local governments, as well as local charities, churches. They were the ones who comprised of the social safety net, to where if people lost their jobs, or they lost their farms, they lost their property, you would have these entities and these groups that would provide temporary assistance for these people to get them back on their feet. The problem, though, was that because the Great Depression was so severe, it's still regarded as the most severe economic downturn in American history, followed by closely a couple of years ago. So now when I teach the Great Depression, I like to compare the Great Depression to what happened a couple of years ago with the COVID shutdown, right? Remember, a lot of people lost their jobs, right? Businesses, that was when everything shut down, right? Businesses had to close. I remember gas was down to 150 because nobody was driving, right? So there wasn't a demand for gas. So that's when they put in the curfews and all that. Everything was on lockdown, right? So that's a similar situation in terms of the strong the strong economic downturn. Now, the difference, of course, is today we have a federal government that is a lot more responsive to those emergencies, right? Because when the stock market crashed, this was an emergency of unseen proportions that the United States had never dealt with, right? Look at the number of people that were unemployed, right? By 1932, 25% of the workforce was unemployed. The state and local governments, as well as the NGOs, the nonprofits, the churches, there's no way that they could have handled so many people at the same time needing assistance. They were completely overrun. So the problem, though, is that unlike today, where we have government assistance, right? You all remember, I think, we all got the stimulus checks, right? I mean, because the federal government was being proactive to assist with the people, because it's not the people's fault that the virus hit, right? So people still needed to pay their bills and things like that. So we had the stimulus. We also had like the CARES Act that provided funding for restaurants and businesses to be able to stay afloat, so they wouldn't have to, even though unfortunately, some restaurants did fail during the pandemic, and they also had to pay rent, for rental assistance, things like that. All of these different programs that you all saw a couple of years ago, none of this existed back then, because President Herbert Hoover, elected in 1928, the year before the Depression hit, argued that state and local governments needed to handle the economic crisis, right? So President Hoover was making the argument that it's not the federal government's job to get involved, right? That this is a state and local affair, and that the federal government did not have the power to provide assistance to the state and local governments to handle the Depression. So in comes President Franklin Roosevelt, who defeats Herbert Hoover in the 1932 election. And FDR is regarded as one of the greatest presidents of all time, and mostly because of his ability to think outside the box here, right? So President Hoover was kind of, he was making the argument, like I said, kind of, within the box here, saying, okay, the federal government can't do these things, and we're limited by dual federalism and things like that. Whereas FDR said, no, I'm not going to be constrained by that. This is an emergency. We have to respond. So FDR pledged to create a more activist federal government to address the nation's economic problems, because FDR was making the argument that the state and local governments are overwhelmed. The only level of government that can actually help out is the federal government. So this is where we see that monumental shift to where now we have the New Deal policies, right? I'm sure you all are familiar with the New Deal, right? Which started that there were several rollouts of the New Deal policies. There was part one, part two. You don't necessarily have to worry about the specifics of that. That's more over history. But what I want for y'all to understand is that during the New Deal, this is where we started to see the federal government start to take on these roles right here, right? So we talked about this last time, right? We talked about how that now we start to see a more activist federal government that is going to engage in policies that are going to try to assist with the people. Now, the book also talks about it, and I also have a good video which discusses this as well. The relief, recovery, and reform policies that FDR instituted, right? So, and he did this in this order, and it's interesting because I actually use this in my own personal life. Like when I look at a problem, I myself use the relief, recovery, and reform model because when you have a problem, first you have to provide relief to how you're feeling, right? If you've got an issue, you have to provide relief to what's going on, right? You have to feel, you have to end the issue, right? You have to end the pain or the suffering, whatever you're going through. Then recovery is where you get back on track, right? You heal up from what happened to you, and then you're getting better. You're rehabilitating. And then reform is where you make changes to where you don't let what happened to you happen again. So even though that's kind of like outside the scope of what we're talking about here, because we're talking about how this relates to the New Deal policies, but me personally, I use that idea in my own personal life because it's true, right? I mean, when you've got a problem, yes, you need to look for solutions, but that comes later, right? You have to deal with the feelings, you have to deal with what you're going through in that moment, you have to feel better, right? And then once you're better, then you can start to look at you can start to problem solve it, so to speak. So I totally agree with what FDR did in this sense, right? Where when it comes to providing relief, the first thing they had to do was to provide relief to the workers, right? To provide them, with some government assistance, right? So this is where we have the introduction of the food stamp program, right? The SNAP program. It's called SNAP, but colloquially they call it food stamps, right? We also have the Social Security program that was instituted, right, with those Social Security payments, which we'll talk about, these when it comes to the different types of grants here. And then so that provides the relief, right? Recovery is the ability for people to kind of get back on their feet, right? So also with relief was instituting the bank holidays, because we also had the bank runs at the time where people were taking all their money out, and then of course the banks ended up failing because everyone took their money out at the same time. If any of y'all have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, they always show it during Christmas time. There's a scene in that movie where they have the bank run there at the building and loan, right? It's I have it in the additional resource. It's a really good scene, but yeah, it encapsulates what a bank run looked like because back then, before the New Deal policies, the banks weren't really being regulated, and so what would happen is that you had all these banks that were failing because everyone took all their money out at the same time because there was a panic. So FDR instituted some policies to where now the banks are insured under the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, right? So that's an important distinction, right? Because if the banks if a bank goes under, you're not going to lose your money up to $250,000. So anything that you had in your, so my money is in a certain bank, and so if that bank were to fail, the federal government would insure that the money that I had in there, right? So that eliminated these bank runs because now there was insurance, right? There was, your money was insured. But again, and then of course reform went as a way to ensure that these types of incidences would not happen again. The Wall Street crash, the lack of regulation on Wall Street. So this allowed for the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission that regulates Wall Street. And we just had a lot more regulation here within the federal government, right? This was the dawning of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set forth minimum wage laws, the 40-hour work weeks. We also had child labor that was abolished here. So there was a lot of reforms that were put in here. Now, these are just a few examples, right? So the new national programs that President Roosevelt developed came through what are called grants and aid. And grants and aid are programs through which Congress provides money to state and local governments on the condition that the funds be employed for purposes defined by the federal government. So we were talking about, when the federal government is going to provide grant money to states, local governments, that they can't just use the money for whatever they want to, right? The federal government has specific guidelines for what the money is going to be used for, right? And this is no different than what we see today, right? So if let's say you're a police department and you see a grant that the federal government is offering to you, um, you have to make sure that if you're awarded that grant money, that you have to spend it according to the terms and conditions of what the grant is saying, right? No different than a contract. I've actually taken a grants and contracts class as one of my public administration classes, and I was able to learn like how the grant process basically works, right? Where this is why a lot of institutions, like even STC, they have what are called grant writers, where you're responsible for writing up the proposal for how the grant is going to be used, right? So basically the way it works is you see a grant, if there's like an educational grant that STC could be or any college would qualify for, then you read through the grant description. It's like a job description, right? I have a link to the website grants.gov, which you can search a lot of different grants, and you can see who's eligible for the grants, how much money it's for, how long it is, how many years it is. Is it a grant that is ongoing? Can it be renewed, or is it just a one-time thing? And so, of course, obviously, you have to study the grant requirements, right? And so then, after studying the grant requirements, then of course you type up your grant proposal. You talk about how the money is going to be used, things like that. And so, if you get approved, then you also have to. It doesn't just end there, right? Where if you get approved and then you get the money, no, you also have to send in reports to the federal government about how the money's being used. You have to submit, uh, documentation, right? Like when it comes to the expenses, things like that. It's a lot of paperwork, but the federal government is pretty strict in terms of ensuring that that money that's being granted to the state and local governments, that it is used the way it's supposed to be used, right? So a lot of red tape here. But anyway, yeah. So a lot of these early programs were grants and aid, right? So the new expanded grants and aid to include the social programs, like we talked about, Social Security, as well as the SNAP program, and later expanded to school lunches and highway construction, right? So yeah, a lot of federal money goes into a lot of these construction projects, right? Because the state only has, as well as the counties, they only have so much money that they can spend on roads and the upkeep, right? So they look to the federal government to provide that funding. That's why a couple of years ago, when we finally got the interstate designation, we didn't used to have it, right? But now we have the Interstate 2 here, right? We have that along the expressway here in the valley. That designation was important because now we can, the expressway can tap into federal funds now, because now it's an interstate. Even though the road it's not like they painted it differently, right? They put that sign on there, right? Because now it's an interstate, but it's important, behind the scenes, because now we're able to access, more of that federal money here, right? Because it is an interstate, so here. And then of course the school lunches, like we also mentioned before, the school districts will get federal money for the school lunches. And of course, as I mentioned before, this is important because um, the reason why the federal government is going to provide money to the school districts for the school lunches is that the federal government, of course, wants for students to be well fed, because that will help them in their studies and that will help them do better in school. That's the idea. Now, let me also mention something else about the school lunches. Now, I think some of you all, I know when I was younger, I would get the free lunches, because, my mom didn't make that much, and she had, there was three of us. So she qualified, right? Because she didn't make as much, she was a single mom, a school teacher, with three kids, so obviously, of course, she qualified because she wasn't making that much. And I know some of y'all, may be familiar with the free or the reduced lunch programs, right? Now, I don't know if you all remember this, when if you all remember going back to school, if you all were getting the free lunches. Does anyone remember that they were really strict about that? They were really they like, if you were getting the free lunches, that they were really strict about how they administered them. What I mean by this is, did anyone ever tell you that, like, when you're getting the lunch, that you have to get like everything on the plate, right? You can't pick and choose, right? You have to take everything that the plate comes with. I don't know. Does anyone remember that, or Does that kind of sound familiar? Like, the schools being strict about the food that you were getting. I don't know. Does anyone kind of remember that or not really? Because there's a reason for this, right? I'm going somewhere with this. Does anyone kind of remember that or not really? That they would be really strict about making sure that you got all the food on the plate. Does anyone kind of remember that or not really? If you don't, that's okay, because let me explain really quickly. Hold on, let me see someone in the chat. Yes, they did. Okay, Hazel. Yes. Now let me kind of explain why that is. Because that's the federal government telling the schools that in order for you to continue to get this grant money for the school lunches, you have to ensure that the students are eating a balanced nutritional meal. Okay, that's why they're strict about that, because the federal government is not going to send all this money to the school districts if the students aren't eating the fruits, the vegetables that go with the school lunches. So does that kind of make sense as to why they're strict about that, right? Because it's not the school's money, it's the federal government's money. And so they have to adhere to those federal requirements for the schools to be able to continue to get the money. Does that kind of make sense or not really, in terms of why they're strict about that? Which they didn't tell us that. It would have been nice if they could have told us that when I was in school. I would have found that interesting. Oh, okay, so the federal government's telling you all why we have to do this, but no one ever told me that. They just said, oh yeah, it's just the rule. Like, well, yeah, it would have been nice to know where the rule came from. But at least now you all know, right? At least now you all know where it comes from here, right? But yes, that's why they're strict about that, because it's the federal money and the federal government puts in those requirements. Okay, so now let's move on to other types of grants. Let's get to categorical grants. So there's also certain types of grants, federal grants and aid, right? So these are the categorical grants. So these grants are given to states on the condition that expenditures be limited to a problem or a group specified by law. So the categorical grants are a little bit more specialized here, right? So many categorical grants in the 1960s were more national in scope, such as the Medicaid program. Now, we've kind of talked a little bit about Medicare and Medicaid before, so keep in mind that Medicaid is the federally sponsored healthcare program for poorer people, right? So this is for people who are living, below the poverty line, right? And incidentally, you can qualify for both Medicaid and Medicare. My grandmother does. So my mother's not going to qualify for Medicaid because she made too much, but my grandmother does because the only money she gets every month is her Social Security check. She gets about $1,000. So yeah, so she's definitely below the poverty line. That's of course why, I pay all her bills because she shouldn't have to worry about bills. Friday's going to be her birthday. She's going to be 85. She shouldn't have to worry about paying her bills. So I take care of that, because she should just enjoy, her last years. But yes, but in terms of, but she does qualify for Medicaid because of the fact that she hardly makes anything, she hardly takes home anything at all here. So the value of categorical grants has risen dramatically, increasing from 54.8 billion in 1960 to an estimated 667.3 billion in 2019, right? So we see here, I think there's a chart here. Yeah, here's the chart, and then we'll come back. So you can see here that this chart shows the rise in these federal grants, right? So the federal grants and aid is, pretty much the main way that the federal government is able to, provide these grants, to the state and local governmental entities, right? So we see that the number is going to start to increase after Medicaid is enacted during the Johnson administration, during LBJ's time, and we see it starting to go up here. It takes a little bit of dive during the Reagan administration, when the conservatives, kind of well, it went up here during, this is Jimmy Carter's administration. Then it goes down again during Reagan, and then it goes back up a little bit during Clinton's time, and then it starts to really increase during the George W. Bush era. So it's not necessarily synonymous with the different with the different political parties, because even Republicans, pretty much around 2000, we start to see the federal government really starts to increase in its size and its scope and the costs here. And of course, continuing on to the Obama administration, although it went down a little bit, and then it goes back up during the Trump administration. So, it's ultimately, bottom line, the federal government spending is a lot higher than what it used to be, and it's pretty much there's pretty much an expectation that it's going to stay at least at these high levels, especially with rising costs of healthcare and the costs of of ensuring, people 65 and older with Medicare, and then, the poor people, with, on Medicaid and things like that. So you can see that, the federal grants and aid have really increased, uh, very, very much so. Again, even starting off into the 1970s and even continuing into, over here into the 2000s, right? So yeah, so very interesting graph to see in terms of how that's worked, right? Um, so when it comes to the cooperative federalism, right? So all of this, of course, leads us to our discussion of cooperative federalism, right? Which is the growth of categorical grants helped bring about what's called cooperative federalism. Give me just a moment here. Sorry. Okay. So cooperative federalism is a model in which various levels of government work together to solve policy problems, right? So in the name pretty much defines it, right? Where the federal government and the state and local governments are cooperating with each other, and they're working together to solve these policy problems that affect, all the levels of government. Again, I gave you all example a little while ago, national security and border security. This is something that doesn't just affect the federal government; it also affects people within the states and within the local communities, right? So it makes sense to have a system in place that allows for that coordination and cooperation. So intergovernmental cooperation and sharing make it difficult, though, to distinguish where the responsibilities of the national government end and where the responsibilities of state and local governments begin, right? So now cooperative federalism has created a situation where now it's really hard to distinguish and determine where these different levels of government start and end, because they're all working on pretty much the same thing, right? And that does become confusing if we go back to chapter one, right? Remember we talked about political knowledge and understanding how government operates. Well, things have gotten even more complicated since when the Constitution was founded, because now we have a situation where you don't have that clear distinction, right? I mentioned before how dual federalism is like where you have a neighbor that you don't talk to, you have that wall separating each other. Cooperative federalism is where you hang out with your neighbors to go watch the Super Bowl, like we had last weekend, right? So that's an example of cooperative federalism where yes, you have that fence there, but you all go to each other's houses, you all hang out, you all are friends. So that's kind of how I like to compare cooperative federalism, where yes, you're at their house or they're at your house, but you're working together, right, to grow the fajitas and watch the Super Bowl, so to speak, right? So that's a good example of how now the states and the federal government as well as the local governments do cooperate with each other, but it does create more confusion now because now people might not necessarily be able to distinguish between just simply a federal issue or a state or local issue. That's why, like in the signature assignment final project essay, that's why pretty much anything could be considered like a federal issue, because there's so much overlap between the federal government and the states that pretty much anything that you can think of is going to have some sort of federal involvement, even education. Um, we have the U.S. Department of Education, right? You might think to yourself, well, why is there a Department of Education? Isn't education supposed to be a state issue? Well, yes, that is true, but it's complicated. It's complicated in terms of how that is. But the point is that now, of course, we have more of this cooperation, right? So the federal government often provides some portion of funding which is sent by the states or localities, right? And so I've mentioned before how the way this works is that because the federal government, again, I don't want to say that they have unlimited money, but they certainly have a lot more access to money than the states or the local governments do, right? The states or local government and local governments are a lot more limited in terms of what they can spend, how much they can spend, how much money is coming in, whereas the federal government pretty much can, they can, pretty much. I don't want to say create money out of thin air. It's a little more complicated than that when it comes to the economics. But I guess what we can say is they certainly have a lot more leeway and a lot more flexibility when it comes to money, as opposed to the state and local governments, because the United States, of course, is the one that has the currency, right? So the federal government has much more access to money, so to speak, right? The cooperative federalism, of course, is designed to encourage states and localities to pursue nationally defined goals, right? So the states and the local governments are pretty much, again, I don't want to say they're at the mercy of the federal government, but when the federal government has the money, the states and local governments almost kind of feel like they kind of have to, take the money. They kind of have to. So if they do take the money, they're caught in this catch-22 where they need the money, but then the federal government is going to have power over them. So especially in some conservative areas. That's why, like Texas is a little bit hesitant to accept the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare, because now Texas might, they might feel like they're going to have to be subjected to more government regulation and oversight and things like that. So that's why some of these more conservative states are a little bit hesitant to take some of this federal money, because that also means federal regulation, so to speak, right? So again, I know this is not the most exciting thing in the world. I get it, but it's important to understand, because money is the lifeblood of a government, right? Without money, the government's not going to be able to do anything, right? So we definitely do have to understand where the money comes from. And so if you have a situation where, again, let's go back to the police department example, right? So let's say you have a situation where you've got a small police force. They rely on that federal funding to pay some of their officers. Then the police department's going to feel like they have to take that money, because there's no way for them to make up the difference of that money if they don't take the federal grants. I don't know. Does that kind of make sense, to where, like, especially if it's like a small department where, federal money makes up a big portion of their yearly budget, then they're going to feel like they have to take the money and they can't really say no. And if they do take the money, then I mentioned they have to adhere to those federal requirements, right? They have to submit those reports, and that's the whole point of these grants, everyone. That's how the federal government is able to gain influence within state and local affairs, through the money. So that's how the federal government is able to get for the states and local governments to kind of do what the federal government is wanting them to do, because of the money, right? It's, that's the incentive, right? And things like that. So I don't know if this all makes sense to you all, right? That the state and local governments, they kind of feel like indebted, so to speak, if they're taking the federal money. And in a lot of cases, they might have no choice, because they're not able to come up with the money that they need on their own, because of their limited ability to raise that money. Okay, so political scientist Morton Grodzin used the cake analogy. For dual federalism, it's depicted as the layer cake. The responsibilities of the national government and state governments are clearly separated along those different layers of the cake. And then cooperative federalism is depicted as a marble cake, because the national policies, state policies, and local policies overlap in many areas, right? So as you can see here, this is definitely a good example of the federalism cake analogy here. Let me take another swig of water here. This is a good analogy, because as you can see here, with the dual federalism, you see how there's that layer, right? You see, you've got the two different layers, the different cakes, right? So there's not any overlap. Whereas here, the different, the different, the different flavors are baked into each other, right? So you can't cut anywhere. Like, you can't cut the layers here, because you're going to get both of the cake flavors here, right? So it's kind of baked in here, right? So this is kind of how cooperative federalism works, right? Where you're not sure where the national government ends and where the state government begins, right? Because it's all kind of interlapping with each other, so to speak, right? So this is definitely a really good analogy when you're trying to determine which of these two, right? The dual federalism has the clear separation, and the cooperative federalism does not here. Okay, so there's a couple more key terms that we'll get into really quickly. So we're already almost winding down here, so let's kind of go through this as quickly as we can here. So again, you also have to remember the political times with some of these eras, right? So of course, obviously, during the 1930s and the 40s, this is, when, this is the rise of, like, the modern American liberalism with FDR, the idea of expanding the role of the federal government to provide for more social services and more regulation of the economy. Then, of course, so the Democrats, are pretty much in power for the most part. We do have Eisenhower, there in the 1950s. Then, of course, JFK and LBJ come into power, and then, of course, this is they continue with FDR's vision, so to speak, where under the Johnson administration, of course, we have the Great Society with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and then Medicare and Medicaid. Then, of course, we get to Nixon in the early 70s, right? And this is where we start to see the turn more towards conservative politics, right? So Nixon, of course, being a Republican, this was the move more towards more towards a regulated federalism, right? So we would see, of course, some pushback on this when we get to Reagan as well here. So regulated federalism, of course, is a form of federalism in which Congress imposes legislation on states and localities requiring them to meet national standards, right? So this is where we start to see the beginnings of, OSHA and the EPA, right? So Nixon, a lot of people forget that even though Nixon was a Republican and he was still, more conservative than LBJ and JFK, that didn't mean that he wasn't into this whole idea, that he didn't buy into more of this regulated federalism, right? So the EPA was actually created under the Nixon administration. A lot of people don't know that. That's why some people say, would Nixon be a Republican today? That's a whole other story. But with that being said, so we start to see these regulations be put in place, right? Like with OSHA, right? The occupational safety hazard, right? Then of course we have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, where now Congress as well, so the way this works is that Congress passes legislation, and then you have these federal agencies, right? Where they put regulations that the states and local governments as well as private entities have to follow, right? So they have to meet those national safety standards. So regulated federalism, we mostly see it like with safety, right? When it comes to like having a safe work place and work environment, this is where we have, and of course the state also gets involved in this, right? So I don't know if any of y'all have heard of like workers' comp, where if you get hurt on the job, you have to file paperwork with the state, and then they send you to a doctor, and then the doctor has to approve, if you can go back to work. So yeah, if you get hurt on the job, the government does have to step in, and you have to submit that documentation, right? And the reason for this is because, the government is now, is trying to ensure that workplaces are as safe as possible, right? Because again, this goes back to when workplaces weren't safe back during the Gilded Age and things like that. So now, of course, we've had a change of this to where now the government is involved in making sure that there's more regulation of these businesses and industries, right? So with increased federal funding, federal government often demands higher standards and stricter use for these funds. So yes, the more money that you're going to get, which makes a lot of sense, right? If the federal government is going to hand out like $1 million grants, then you better believe that the federal government is going to have is going to be very strict in how that grant is going to be carried out, right? They're not just going to give $1 million for nothing, right? So yeah, those grants that are very expensive, those multi-million dollar grants, you better believe they're going to come with a lot of requirements, right? A lot of reporting, a lot of paperwork, a lot of strict standards. So as the federal government was providing more money to the states, the standards also rose as well here. National standards require the federal government to take over areas of regulation. Preemption is the principle that allow national government to override state and local actions in certain policy areas. Preemption occurs when state or local actions do not agree with national requirements, and the state or local governments often contest federal preemption, such as doctor-assisted suicide in Oregon. This, of course, was the famous Dr. Kevorkian situation, right, where people were wanting to. This was usually like for terminally ill patients who wanted to, basically get euthanized, right? I mean, we see it like with pets and animals, right? Where an animal gets put down. So basically, you had some people that wanted to make the choice to be put down, right? Because of, the terminal illnesses that they had, right? But of course, this was in violation of, what the federal government felt was legal. So this is right. So preemption is an option where the federal government can step in and can undo state and local requirements in the policy areas, especially if the federal government is providing funding for this, right? So again, the money that the federal government has is a really big it's a really big deterrent to some of these state and local entities that might want to do something different, right? Now, the end of dual federalism was a blow to advocates for states' rights. And we've talked about states' rights before. We talked about this in chapter 2, right? And also towards the beginning of this chapter, right, with the 10th Amendment, right? So states' rights, of course, refers to the principle that a state does not have to submit to national laws. The principle applies in cases where a state contends that the national government exceeded its authority. Former Vice President John Calhoun agreed with nullification. So this kind of goes back to your U.S. History Part 1. This was, down in South Carolina with the nullification crisis, where South Carolina was threatening to secede before, back in the 1830s, right? So even before the Civil War occurred, South Carolina was already threatening secession, when it came to a, disagreement of, federal laws and policies, right? So he proposed that the states were not bound by federal laws that they considered to be unconstitutional. And again, we would see later on how this argument would play itself out when it came to the formation of the Confederacy, right? So again, the idea of states' right, of course, is that that the states under traditional federalism, that the states have their own autonomy when it comes to certain governmental responsibilities. And that still occurs to this day, right? I mentioned before how the federal government still does, that the states still take the lead on a lot of these different powers. It's just that now the federal government has a little bit more an influence over it due to the money here, right? Um, so in the 1950s, opponents of civil rights brought back the concept of states' rights to defend racial segregation. The Southern Manifesto had declared the Southern states were not constitutionally bound by Supreme Court decisions outlawing racial segregation, such as Roberts Board of Education, which we'll get to later on here in Chapter 5. The slogan states' rights became tarnished by its association with racial inequality, right? Because it was the whole concept of, states' rights to do what? To ignore Roberts Board of Education, to not integrate the schools. And so, yeah, so it did get that negative connotation because of what the Southern states wanted to use the states' rights for. And then in the 1990s, of course, there was a revival of interest in the 10th Amendment. Much of the interest stemmed from conservatives who believed that a strong federal government encroached on individual liberties. The Supreme Court did rule that Congress exceeded power in two decisions. In U.S. v. Lopez, this case was from Texas, struck down a federal law that barred handguns near schools here. So I'm sorry that we're going to have to run through this really quickly. I do want to kind of get through this chapter here. And then Prince v. U.S. declared unconstitutional a provision of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act that required state and local officials to conduct background checks on handgun purchases, right? So these two cases, mostly dealt with Second Amendment issues, right? When it came to, and again, and this is not surprising, right? Because, as we'll get to later on in Chapter 4, there's tons of cases involving the Second Amendment. Like we'll get to the U.S. v. Heller case, the McDonald v. Chicago case. So a lot more of these recent cases dealing with what the Second Amendment means. So these are, of course, a couple of cases, but we'll talk about them a little bit later here, right? So, okay, let's get to devolution here really quickly. So, again, like I mentioned, so during the 1970s, even though we did have, Nixon institute, some of the, these regulations, we also started to see more of these conservative ideas take place, such as devolution. We would also see devolution really ramp up during the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Devolution refers to the transferring of responsibility for policy from the federal government to state or local governments. Proponents of devolution argued that it allows states to become innovators in experiments of policy, and good ideas from one state spread to others in a process called policy diffusion. So let me kind of explain what all this means here. Let me take another swig of water here really quickly here. Excuse me. Okay, hold on. Okay, let me just check something really quickly. Hold on. Okay, all right, sounds good. Okay, so let's kind of explain this a little bit further here. Now, as I was mentioning here before, so the conservative movement in American, especially at the national level in American politics in the 1970s and 80s. So there was some pushback in terms of what was going on with federalism, right? So you have to remember, right? Like especially with Reagan, right? Reagan was very big on, limiting the size and scope of the federal government. I remember I showed you all that chart where the funding went down during the Reagan administration. So the idea of devolution is to not have so many of these requirements, these stringent requirements for the state or local governments to follow. Instead, no, I said, let me rephrase that. What I meant to say was that, yes, there's going to be requirements, but instead of the federal government putting those requirements, it's going to be the states that are going to do so. So what this allows is that this allows for the states and local governments to get the federal money, but they don't have as many of those requirements. That's what I meant to say, right? That they don't have to meet as many of these requirements as before, right? Instead, they're the ones that kind of set the requirements and the policies and the way that the programs are going to be set up. So let me give you an example of this. Okay, now several years ago, in 2014, it was 2014. It was early 2014. I temporarily moved to Laredo because I was starting my master's program there. I had just graduated with a master's in criminal justice, but I was having trouble, getting hired to teach criminal justice. So I felt, okay, well, let me study political science and history. Let me see how that works. So I discovered that there was a cool program at TAMU there in Laredo where you could do an interdisciplinary graduate degree in history and poli sci. So that was the year I started there, right? So originally I moved to Laredo for a few months, and then I got a job as a criminal justice teacher here in the Valley. So then I ended up just driving to Laredo and driving back. So I did that. So it was only the first semester that I actually stayed in Laredo, and then I decided, you know what, I could just drive. It's not that far. I could just drive over and just drive back. I don't necessarily have to live here. But the point is that so I was there for a few months, and and so I was in between jobs. I was doing subbing, but I wasn't really making much of anything. So that's when I applied for the SNAP program. So yes, I did used to have the Lone Star card. I don't know where it is. It's here somewhere in my house, but I used to have it. So I applied for the SNAP program. So remember we talked about that the SNAP program is a federal program, right? It's federal money. But I wasn't contacting the federal government to apply for SNAP. I was applying with the Texas Health and Human Services, department. So there's a reason for this because even though the SNAP program is a federal program, it's administered by the states. So the states are the ones who decide who set the eligibility requirements. The states are the ones who decide who gets what and how much do they get. So you might think to yourself, okay, that's interesting, right? So it's federal money, but the states decided. So that goes to this idea of devolution, right? Where we're devolving power from the federal government to the states. And the idea behind this is that the idea behind this decision is that the argument is that the states would know better in terms of who should get the money. They know more about the current climate in their state in terms of the current economic situation, the current needs of the community, because the states are closer to the community than the federal government is, right? So that's kind of the idea, right? That's always been the anti-federalist idea, right? That the states would know their citizens more so than the federal government does, which is a little bit more detached and far away in Washington. So that's an example of devolution where even though it's a federal program, the states are the ones who administer it, right? So, and then I'll always remember that I was getting about 200 a month, and then as soon as I got to Laredo, I got hired at an elementary. Thankfully, like that same week when I finally moved over there, I had an interview with an elementary, and they gave me the job. So I was very thankful that I had work over there, even though the job only paid me 750 a month. Like I was making less than minimum wage because they prorate it for the summer, which I don't understand why they do that. I'm a smart person and I still don't get it. I would have rather have just gotten just pay me my hourly rate and then just don't pay me in the summer, right? So that's fine. I need the money now. So, but regardless of that, so then the state found out that I was working, and then they cut down my food stamps to $15, and I was like, what? Like I'm making hardly anything, and you cut it from 200 to 15. Like I knew they were going to cut it somewhat. I expected maybe like down to 100. That's what I thought they would cut it, but they cut it down to 15, and I was like, what? Like that's insane. But anyway, that's a whole other story. So, but again, I want you to understand what devolution is and why we have it, right? Because the idea is that the states are the ones who would know better in terms of the needs of the community, and it also allows for states to be innovators, right? Different states can spend the money in different ways, and then they can kind of learn from each other, right, so to speak. Proponents of greater state power have looked into what are called block grants, right? Block grants are federal grants and aid that allow states considerable discretion in how the funds are spent. So block grants are different, from the grants and aid and the categorical grants, because again, there's not as stringent on the requirements as the previous grants, right? So President Nixon pushed for more block grants in the 1970s as part of his new federalism approach, the return of power to the states through the block grants approach. So again, this continues what we're talking about, this idea that the federal government will institute these block grants, and then the states will kind of be the ones who will decide how the money is going to be spent, right? So giving the states more leeway, right? More decision making, right? More input in terms of how the money is going to be spent, right? And then Congress also provided a new form of assistance to state and local government through general revenue sharing, right? General revenue sharing refers to instances in which one unit of government yields a portion of tax income to another unit of government. So this is kind of like where the states will, the federal government will shift money around, so to speak, right? For states that are needing it more than others, right? This is actually not really all that different than what we have here in Texas with the Robin Hood sharing for the school districts, right? Where school districts that are in poorer areas of the state will still receive, extra, state funding from other parts of the state. This is why, I don't know if any of y'all have noticed this, that you can have like a brand new school building in like a poor area, like like I'll give you an example, right? Like, no disrespect to Las Mismas, there was someone that I was romantically involved with who used to live in Las Mismas, but the schools they have there, you can tell like they're newer and they're a lot more fancier, even though the area is kind of impoverished, right? So that's an that so not all that money is coming from that community, right? Because where would they get the money for that, right? Because there's not enough tax revenue coming in, so that gets shared from other parts of the state, right? So this is no different than what we also see at the national level, right? Where some states will get more money, depending on if they're needing it, right? So maybe some of the more affluent states from their tax revenues will send, will supplement it to some of these poorer states, so to speak, right? Okay, let's see. Okay, let's kind of cover this really quickly, and then we'll end here for today. We'll stop at unfunded mandate, yeah, because that's pretty much all that we have time. So President Reagan looked to block grants to return more power to the states, but unlike Nixon, also did so in an effort to cut federal spending, right? So Reagan was definitely more conservative than Nixon here, pretty much overall, but as well as to especially when it came to the cutting of federal spending, right? So the Republican-controlled Congress that was elected in '94 continued to support block grants to cut federal spending. An example is the 1996 welfare reform law, which delegated to states important new responsibilities, right? This was, and Clinton was, President Clinton being a centrist Democrat, he signed this, where he was, the welfare reform law was meant to provide more restrictions on welfare, right? Like when we're talking about SNAP or the TANF, the temporary need to, temporary assistance to needy families, right? The money that they would get, where, and these requirements were that you had like lifetime cap limits to how much money you could get to continue being on welfare, or the unemployment also. Like if let's say you lose your job, you can also apply for unemployment benefits. They also have those requirements there, right? Where as part of your unemployment, you have to be looking for jobs. So you have to turn in documentation showing that you've applied for jobs, that you've been looking for jobs, things like that, just to show that you're not just being on welfare, right? Just to be on there, and not work here, right? So in 2020, the Trump administration gave states the option to convert part of their Medicaid funding into a block grant here. So again, more of these Republican policies try to, have the states have more of this responsibility. Those who argue for more state government control argue that states can be a source of innovation and diffusion. Innovation example here, Minnesota first created charter schools in '91. Now 44 states, the District of Columbia permit them. This is an example of an innovative idea that came up for the state of Minnesota. And then diffusion, the process by which policy decisions in one political jurisdiction are influenced by choices made in another jurisdiction. The example is the Massachusetts healthcare reform of 2006 became the template for the Federal Affordable Care Act of 2010, right? So, right, and Obama even talks about this. He talks about how that it wasn't necessarily his idea. It came from Governor Mitt Romney at the time, so he called it Romney Care. You can look up Romney Care, Obamacare, and it'll talk more about this, right? That in Massachusetts they have tried to institute their version of the Affordable Care Act there at the state level in Massachusetts. So last thing we'll take a look at here is the unfunded mandates here. Nearly all states have legal or constitutional provisions requiring balanced budgets. Texas is no different, right? That Texas they can't operate on a deficit, right? That every dollar that is spent in the state budget has to come from somewhere, right? It has to be accounted for. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, unfunded mandates from the federal government created budgetary problems for state governments. So an unfunded mandate, these are rules for forcing states to spend their own money to comply with federal law. Now, we're going to go over these really quickly, but I just wanted to kind of explain really quickly why unfunded mandates are looked at very unpopularly. People do not like unfunded mandates. So basically, an unfunded mandate is where if the federal government is telling the states that they have to implement a new policy or they have to comply with a federal standard, but the federal government doesn't give them the money to kind of bring their standards up to code, so to speak. So let me give you all an example here. So when I was in elementary, and I know we're already running out of time. Let me just do this last story and then we'll leave. So when I was in elementary, I noticed this was around 1990. Yeah, this was at the turn of the 90s. I noticed that everywhere I was going, I saw that wheelchair ramps were being built everywhere, at HEB, at my school, and I was like, "What's going on? Why are all of these wheelchair ramps suddenly going up everywhere?" Well, it wasn't until many years later when I started studying political science and political history that I realized, I put two and two together. I was like, wait a minute. that was when the ADA was passed, right? In 1990, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed. And so part of the provisions in there was to provide accommodations for people with disabilities. And one of those accommodations was that all the buildings had to have the wheelchair ramps, okay? Now imagine if, let's say, the federal government told the states, okay, you have to get all these wheelchair ramps set up, but we're not going to help you pay for it. You're going to have to come up with that money on your own. That would probably piss the states off, right? Because the states would probably be like, hey, wait a minute, like, so you're telling us to do this, but you're not going to give us the money. Like, well, what gives here? You know, we don't have all this unlimited money, so now we have to incur this added cost. It's also kind of like if, let's say, you're at a job and your boss is going to tell you that you have to you're responsible for a new you're gonna be responsible for something new, but they don't train you on it. You'd kind of be pissed off because you'd be like, what? Well, you're expecting me to do this, but you're not going to train me, so that's not fair. So again, I want you all to kind of understand why unfunded mandates tend to be rather unpopular, right? So the 1973 Rehabilitation Act required state and local governments to make public transit available to the disabled. So this is another. So even before the ADA, you had the Rehabilitation Act, which made it, which provided these mandates for, for more accessibility, to disabled people, right? To put in, to put in the, like you see this on the buses, right? Where they put in the, the accessibility for the wheelchairs, right? Where they put in that door in the back, right? And then you have the machine that drops down that allows for people to get on the buses, right? And in the 1995 law, there was a law to try to reduce unfunded mandates, solve the problem only partially, and many state and local government officials advocate that its coverage be broader, right? So they tried to push back. This was called UMRA, the Unfunded Mandate, the Unfunded Mandate Act, but it wasn't. It only did so much, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and end for today because that's pretty much what we needed to cover. So sorry that I kind of went a little bit overboard here. Sorry that I kind of gave a few too many personal stories here, but I kind of like to tie it into to what we're covering here and how I've experienced some of these examples of federalism, like in my own personal life, right, in terms of things I've seen and how it's even affected me. So, but anyway, so with that being said, okay, so that pretty much covers everything that we need to cover on federalism. So next week we'll start on chapter 4, which deals with civil liberties. I'm not gonna lie, chapter 4 is one of my favorite chapters. I mean, I like all the chapters, but chapter 4 is one of my favorites because we're gonna talk about the Bill of Rights. We're gonna talk about the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We're going to talk about the Second Amendment. We're going to talk about the rights of bear arms. We're going to talk about the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable searches and seizures. We're going to talk about court procedure. Like your right to remain silent, the Miranda rights. We'll talk about the right to a trial by jury. We'll talk about some of these famous cases like Miranda v. Arizona, Gideon versus Wainwright. We'll talk about some of these important cases. So we'll take a look at that within chapter 4. So we'll start that next week. Okay. So the chapter 3 quiz, don't worry about that till next week. Okay, so anybody have any questions before we leave for today? Because I know I don't want to keep you all too much more. I know you might have other classes you'll have to go to or maybe to study. So anything else that I can help you out with for today? Anything else? Anything else? Nothing else, everyone? Hopefully you all found today's discussion a little bit interesting here. And so like I said, I added some of those personal stories to kind of make these concepts a little more real to you all. But okay, sounds good. Okay, everyone. Okay, so we'll go ahead and end for today. So thank you all so much for being patient and bearing with me as we get through one of the more boring chapters. I mean, I don't think it's boring, but I understand it's not quite as exciting. The next chapter will be a little bit more exciting. So, but you all take care, be safe. We'll see you all next time. It's warm, but it'll cool off a little bit, and then it's gonna get warm again. You make it interesting with this. Oh, well, thank you, Ariana. Yes, I know they're not really that exciting stories, but they're just things that I've experienced and things that I've like seen, and I just kind of tie it into like how I've seen some of those things and just but yes, I do appreciate that you do like the stories, so I'll try to add more of those later on, and especially when we get to like the election chapter and the political parties, I'll talk about like some of the things I like, being a former precinct chair. I'll talk about like how the local parties operate and some of the things that I've seen. So but okay, sounds good, everyone. Okay, so y'all take care, be safe, and we'll see you all next time. Okay, everyone, and please email me if you all have any questions. Okay, so thanks for stopping by. I really appreciate you all coming every day. This definitely makes life a lot easier that I actually have, that we can actually have these discussions. So okay, everyone, sounds good. You all take care, and you can always go back and watch the recordings if there's anything that you missed, right? If there's anything that you need to further clarify, you can always go back and watch the recording. So okay, everyone, sounds good. You all take care, be safe, and we'll see you all next time, everyone. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Bye. Take care.